Disney's Tron franchise has quite a bit in common with Blade Runner. Both films hit theaters in 1982, just 3 weeks apart. Both underperformed at the box office, and both had their sequels stuck in development purgatory for years. Eventually, though, they got their follow-ups, thanks in no small part to the die-hard fans who refused to let them fade into obscurity. Sure, if we were measuring cult status on some hypothetical ruler, Blade Runner would probably take the crown. Still, Tron has managed to carve out its own niche fan base. Now, the second Blade Runner sequel struggled to make bank at the box office, while Tron Legacy fared a bit better. Maybe that's why Disney's been dragging out a third Tron sequel for over a decade now. Whenever it finally lands, these two franchises might just end up sharing yet another similarity. A knack for making studios nervous about the bottom line. But let's focus on Tron for now. Despite its rocky start, the franchise has managed to survive and thrive over time, and that's why Disney just can't seem to give up on it. The origin story of the first Tron plays out like some kind of Disney fairy tale. Back in the early 1980s, Steven Lisberger, the film's director, shopped his script all over Hollywood. No one wanted to touch it. A movie about artificial intelligence? Too weird, too confusing, too ahead of its time. But Lisberger wasn't giving up that easily. He roamed Hollywood armed with a suitcase full of storyboards and test footage he'd shot himself. Yet, despite all that hustle, the only thing his pitch meetings got him was a stack of polite rejections. Then, in a twist straight out of a feel-good Disney flick, Lisberger hauled his suitcase into the one studio he hadn't seriously considered: Disney. Back then, Disney was still mostly about kiddie cartoons. But lo and behold, the execs gave his pitch a real shot, and since Lisberger was out of options, he agreed to let Disney produce Tron. At the time, Tron was a pretty ambitious project. Disney poured $17 million into its production, only $1 million shy of the budget for The Empire Strikes Back. Nowadays, the visual effects wouldn't turn any heads, but in 1982, they were cutting edge. Unfortunately, the movie faced some serious challenges. Tron had to compete with Spielberg's E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which smashed every record in sight. Basically, E.T. was the 1982 equivalent of Titanic in 1997. It devoured everything in its path. And let's not forget, the late 70s and early 80s were a tough time for Disney. Their animation department was floundering, and their live-action experiments weren't faring much better. Before Tron, Disney tried its hand at live-action sci-fi with The Black Hole, an even pricier production. That movie tanked at the box office, thanks in part to competition from, you guessed it, Star Trek the Motion Picture. By the time Tron rolled around, Disney was desperate to stand out in a crowded field. Movies like Poltergeist were raking in profits, but Tron? Not so much. Still, it performed better than some other 1982 releases like Blade Runner and The Thing, which also bombed. In the end, Tron earned $33 million in the U.S. and another $17 million internationally. A $50 million haul wasn't bad for a $17 million movie, but it wasn't exactly blockbuster territory either. Disney probably broke even, but they were clearly hoping for more. As for Lisberger, his career never really took off after Tron. He spent years trying to fund new projects, but by the late 80s, he was directing low-budget films and slowly fading from the industry. Meanwhile, his creation was gaining a cult following. Home video sales started climbing, and by the early 90s, Disney began tossing around ideas for a sequel. Over the next 2 decades, various sequel scripts were written and scrapped. By the early 2000s, Tron had cemented its status as a cult classic, and the push for a follow-up intensified. Enter Joseph Kosinski, a director with a background in making video game trailers. Kosinski's vision for the sequel finally got Disney's green light in 2007. Kosinski and the producers put together a teaser to pitch their vision to Disney. They even brought back Jeff Bridges and sent this teaser to Comic-Con. Fans went wild, and the studio couldn't ignore the buzz. Thanks to that enthusiasm, Tron Legacy got the funding it needed to move forward. The same teaser to greenlight strategy worked for the first Deadpool movie years later. For the lead role, Disney considered big names like Chris Pine and Ryan Gosling. But in the end, Garrett Hedlund swooped in and convinced everyone he was the right fit. Tron Legacy was shot in just 2 months, but calling it a smooth process would be an outright lie. The biggest headache? The costumes. Each one had built-in light strips powered by lithium batteries, which lasted a whopping 10 to 12 minutes. That's right, barely enough time to film a single take. Afterward, the assistants had to scramble to turn them off so the actors wouldn't have to strip down and wait for the batteries to recharge. And if someone forgot, well, congratulations, everyone got an unscheduled break. To make matters worse, the circuits in the costumes were as fragile as your grandma's favorite porcelain teapot. Sitting down was out of the question since bending the circuits could break them. To rest, the actors had to stand in designated folding beds. Yep, upright. Of course, everyone was also sweating buckets inside those fancy suits, so the rest areas were crammed with air conditioners. Disney spent a cool $13 million on those light-up costumes. For comparison, they dropped the same amount on the bikes and vehicles. Priorities, right? Now, you might assume most of Tron Legacy was animated, but nope. Unlike today's green screen-drenched blockbusters, the film had actual physical sets. Director Joseph Kosinski, who's also an architect, designed most of them himself, giving the movie a surprisingly grounded aesthetic that still holds up. Unfortunately, post-production turned out to be the film's biggest nightmare. It dragged on for almost 18 months thanks to the sheer volume of computer graphics. Test audiences weren't exactly kind either. Some people dozed off, while others were simply baffled by the plot. Dialogue and character bloat were major criticisms, with too many irrelevant characters hogging screen time. The result? Additional shooting and significant cuts, which meant some actors straight up disappeared from the final film. In total, Tron Legacy cost a staggering $220 million, making it the most expensive debut for a first-time director. Tax breaks brought the official budget down to $170 million, with help from British Columbia and Vancouver, thanks to their generous incentives. When the film hit theaters in December 2010, it debuted at #1, earning $44 million in its opening weekend. But its moment in the sun didn't last long. By week 2, it was dethroned by Little Fockers and True Grit. The final global box office tally came in at $400 million, which isn't great for a $170 million movie, especially since theaters take roughly half the earnings. But wait, it gets worse. Marketing costs reportedly added another $150 million, bringing the total budget to $320 million. For the film to break even, it needed to pull in around $600 million. At the same time, Disney tried expanding the Tron universe with an animated series designed to answer lingering questions. While it wasn't technically canceled, the series ended after just 1 season. Plans for a sequel to Legacy were also shelved thanks to those underwhelming box office numbers. Some blame the film's struggles on its PG rating. Disney loves its family-friendly PG ratings, but let's face it, PG-13 is where the money's at for blockbusters. Just look at Pirates of the Caribbean or any Marvel movie. Meanwhile, Legacy ended up looking like a movie for kids when it was clearly meant for teenagers. Sure, its unique visuals and Daft Punk's killer soundtrack helped salvage some dignity, but it wasn't enough. Tron wasn't the only 2010 PG-rated flop. The Sorcerer's Apprentice, starring a painfully tired Nicolas Cage, also bombed. And while Tron had its style and music to fall back on, all Cage had was his exhausted expression. The PG rating brought its own set of challenges. For example, villains in animated films often meet their end by plummeting into an abyss with a dramatic scream. Why? Because PG guidelines make it tricky to show anything else. While Tron got around this limitation thanks to its digital universe, other restrictions like mild swearing or simple punches couldn't be avoided. As a result, the movie came off as juvenile, leaving its teenage target audience feeling shortchanged. Despite all this, Tron managed to build a loyal fan base in the U.S., and merchandise sales were strong enough to keep the franchise alive. Once it became clear that merchandise was helping recoup costs, Disney put a new sequel into development. The cast even popped up to announce that the next film was in the works and would outshine Legacy. Initially, fans expected a direct sequel. David DiGilio, known for 8 Below, was brought on to write the script. But by 2015, after multiple failed rewrites, Disney scrapped the project without much explanation. In 2017, the studio gave it another shot. This time, they overhauled the concept with new characters and a new plot. Jared Leto joined the cast, and the script wars began again. By early 2020, Joseph Kosinski announced his return to direct. Then, in August 2020, Garth Davis, known for directing Lion, replaced him. Leto, meanwhile, revealed the film's title, Tron on Twitter, a move Disney wasn't thrilled about. The tweet vanished quickly, but the cat was already out of the bag. Rumors suggest the new script is a major improvement, bearing little resemblance to the drafts Disney cycled through from 2010 to 2020. The only holdover, Leto's character, which was pulled from one of the earlier drafts. Reportedly, one good storyline emerged from the rejected material and was expanded into a full-length film. Jeff Bridges is set to return for Tron, which began filming in early 2024. The project faced plenty of skepticism after spending years in development hell, but filming is now complete. The movie is slated for an October 10th, 2025 release. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more updates.